On a Saturday morning in Ottawa, Canada's Prime Minister stood in front of reporters and said something no Canadian leader had said to Washington in living memory. Canada will match Washington's new tariffs dollar for dollar. That single sentence, spoken by Mark Carney, came less than 24 hours after President Donald Trump wrote 2 words on his Truth Social account that would define the next chapter of North American relations. No more. 2 exclamation points. A president who has spent more than a year threatening, cajoling, and pressuring America's northern neighbor had just declared, in his own words, that patience was over. And Canada, instead of backing down, answered back. This is the story of how a decades-old friendship between 2 of the world's most intertwined economies arrived at this moment, why it happened now, and what it actually means for the people on both sides of a border that used to be the least dramatic line on the map. Before we go further back into how this actually got here, it's worth saying plainly. Stories like this one don't resolve in a single news cycle. They move in stages over months, and if that kind of ongoing tracking is useful to you, staying subscribed is the simplest way to catch each new stage as Ottawa and Washington push this further. The stated justification, laid out in the executive order itself, was the flow of fentanyl and illegal migration across the northern border. It's worth pausing on that claim because it has been disputed from the very beginning. U.S. Customs and Border Protection data cited by multiple outlets, including Forbes, showed that only a small fraction of the fentanyl seized at U.S. borders in the prior year had actually come through Canada. The overwhelming majority was intercepted at the border with Mexico. That gap between the stated reason and the underlying numbers has shadowed this entire conflict ever since, and it's a detail worth remembering as the story unfolds, because Ottawa's negotiators have repeatedly pointed back to it when accused of not doing enough. Then Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau responded within days, announcing retaliatory tariffs on 30 billion Canadian dollars of American goods, a figure Ottawa said would expand to 155 billion Canadian dollars if the fight escalated further. But the tariffs were only half the story. Around the same period, Trump began talking publicly about something far more provocative than trade barriers. Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc called it in no way a serious comment. But as the tariffs kept coming and the rhetoric kept repeating, the mood in Ottawa shifted from bemused to genuinely alarmed. That shift had real political consequences. Trudeau, already deeply unpopular heading into 2025, announced his resignation in early January of that year. What followed was one of the more remarkable turnarounds in recent Canadian political history. According to reporting from ABC News, the Conservative Party had been sitting on a 25-point polling lead over the governing Liberals as 2024 came to a close, a lead so large that a Conservative majority government looked like a formality. Then Trump's tariffs and his talk of absorbing Canada changed the entire national conversation. Mark Carney, a former central banker with no prior electoral experience, took over the Liberal leadership and built his campaign almost entirely around standing up to Washington. He coined the phrase, elbows up, a hockey term borrowed to describe a posture of defiant self-protection, and it resonated. Carney won the election. In his first speech as Prime Minister designate, according to Al Jazeera's reporting from Montreal, Carney told a room full of supporters, "I know that these are dark days brought on by a country we can no longer trust." He was talking about the United States, a country that shares the world's longest undefended land border with Canada and, until recently, one of the closest alliances on the planet. It helps to remember just how unusual this fight is by historical standards. The modern U.S.-Canada trading relationship was built deliberately over decades, starting with the 1988 Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement and deepened by NAFTA in 1994, which Trump himself renegotiated into CUSMA during his first term specifically to modernize, not dismantle, that relationship. By the time this current fight began, the 2 economies were among the most integrated in the world. A single car part can cross the Ontario-Michigan border several times during assembly before a finished vehicle ever reaches a dealership, which is one reason the auto tariffs Carney flagged as unacceptable in the collapsed talks matter so much to Ontario specifically. Some of the individual grievances Trump has cited are also not new inventions. American dairy producers have complained about Canada's supply management system, which uses tariffs to protect domestic dairy farmers, for years before Trump ever entered office, and it was already a sticking point during the original CUSMA negotiations in his first term. What's different this time isn't the existence of trade friction. It's the scale of the tariffs, the speed of the escalation, and the fact that a personal political demand for outright annexation has been layered on top of what used to be purely economic bargaining. That personal dimension has led analysts to search for an explanation beyond the official trade deficit and fentanyl arguments. CNN's political analysis noted that there is no long-standing grievance visible in Trump's own historical public statements about Canada before his second term began, which has left commentators speculating about other triggers. The New York Times, in reporting cited by CNN, pointed to the bankruptcies of 2 Trump-branded hotels. one in Toronto in 2016, one in Vancouver in 2021, as one possible personal thread. Others have pointed to a widely circulated video from Trump's first term showing Melania Trump appearing to prepare a cheek kiss for Justin Trudeau, though CNN's own reporting noted the full video made clear it was nothing more than an ordinary greeting. None of these theories are confirmed motives, and this script isn't asserting any of them as fact. They're included here only because they've been seriously discussed by credentialed reporters trying to explain an otherwise puzzling shift in tone toward a longtime ally. Trump did not let up after Carney took office. He continued invoking the 51st state idea well into his second year. At one point in October of 2025, according to reporting from The Hub, he floated it again in a speech to U.S. military officials, suggesting Canada could get access to the Golden Dome missile defense program for free if it joined the Union. In June of 2026, when a report noted Canada had entered a technical recession, Trump responded on social media with just two words, 51st state, according to Times reporting. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who has emerged as one of the loudest Canadian voices against the pressure campaign, shot back publicly, saying he couldn't believe he had to keep repeating that Canada is not for sale. In July of 2025, Trump sent Carney a letter published on Truth Social announcing a 35% tariff on Canadian goods effective August 1st, layered on top of existing sectoral tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos. The letter repeated the fentanyl justification and added a new complaint about what Trump called Canada's many tariff and non-tariff policies and trade barriers. According to the BBC, this was one of more than 20 similar letters Trump sent to trade partners that week, part of a broader global tariff offensive. But Canada's situation carried an extra edge because of the annexation talk layered on top of it. Through the back half of 2025 and into early 2026, the two countries went through cycles of tense negotiation, temporary truces, and renewed threats with CUSMA, the Canada-United States-Mexico trade agreement that replaced NAFTA during Trump's first term, hanging over every conversation as a legal framework increasingly treated as optional by the American side. At one point in December 2025, Trump said he was open to simply letting the agreement expire. Then came a genuine legal turning point. On February 20th of 2026, the United States Supreme Court ruled, in a case called Learning Resources versus Trump, that the president could not use emergency powers under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to justify sweeping tariffs. According to NerdWallet's coverage of the ruling, the court found that the law simply does not grant the executive branch authority to create tariffs in the way Trump had used it, both for the original fentanyl and migration tariffs on Canada and for the broader Liberation Day tariffs imposed against multiple countries in April of 2025. This was a real legal check, not a political talking point, and it forced a recalibration. Rather than abandoning tariffs altogether, Trump pivoted to a new 10% global tariff structure that largely exempted goods compliant with CUSMA rules of origin, according to Wikipedia's detailed timeline of the trade war, which is itself sourced from major wire coverage. Sector-specific tariffs on Canadian cars, aluminum, steel, and lumber, imposed under different legal authorities than the ones the Supreme Court struck down, remained in place. For a few months, there was a fragile sense that the worst of the crisis might be behind both countries. That fragile calm was visible even at the leader-to-leader level. Trump also continued to dangle defense cooperation as a possible sweetener during this period. The Golden Dome missile defense proposal he floated to Canada carried an eye-catching price tag. Reports put the cost of Canadian participation at around $61 billion, part of a broader, roughly $175 billion American missile shield program targeted for completion by 2029. And Canadian officials, including Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, acknowledged the idea had been discussed at a high level without Ottawa giving any definitive answer. Public sentiment inside Canada shifted alongside the politics. Angus Reid polling found that the share of Canadians describing themselves as very proud of their country jumped 10 percentage points, from 34 to 44% between December of 2025 and February of 2026, a swing pollsters directly linked to the annexation rhetoric and tariff pressure rather than any single domestic event. That reaction is also consistent with Canada's much longer history of resisting union with the United States whenever the idea has surfaced. A Gallup poll taken around the heated Meech Lake constitutional negotiations of 1990 found just 13% of Canadians surveyed supported their province joining the U.S., with 79% opposed. Even further back, a 1964 Maclean's commissioned poll found only 17% in favor of a union between the two countries. In other words, when Leger's recent polling found only about 13% of Canadians currently favoring 51st state status, with the overwhelming majority opposed, that wasn't a new reaction to Trump specifically. It reflected a remarkably consistent, decades-long Canadian position that the current moment has simply brought back into the headlines. That fragile calm did not survive the summer. This is where the freshest layer of the story begins, and it's the layer that gives this title its meaning. Through the early and middle parts of August 2026, according to CNBC's reporting, negotiators from both governments spent the week working intensively on a new deal, and at several points that week, sources close to the talks signaled that an agreement was near. Then, late on Friday, August 21st, the talks collapsed. Reuters and CNN both reported that Carney characterized the American proposal in blunt terms, saying the U.S. had asked for too much and offered too little. According to CNN's account, Canada had offered real concessions, removing its existing retaliatory tariffs from the previous year and allowing American alcohol back into Canadian liquor stores. But the United States reportedly would not agree to what Carney called sensible economic terms for core industries, especially the automotive sector. And when asked about critical minerals, Carney said Canada would never grant the U.S. exclusive access. He also said American negotiators had made unacceptable demands touching on Canada's ability to negotiate future trade deals with other countries, and in a detail that struck many observers as particularly pointed, he said S negotiators had made threats aimed at the French language and Quebec culture, according to Al Jazeera's reporting from Ottawa. The response from Washington came fast. On Saturday, August 22nd, the United States imposed 50% tariffs on roughly $20 billion worth of Canadian goods, according to Al Jazeera's reporting, hitting sectors including wine, furniture, dairy products, cement, clothing, fishing rods, and hockey equipment, about 5.5% of all Canadian exports to the U.S. Then came the post that gives this story its title. Writing on Truth Social early that Sunday, President Trump said, "Canada wants the benefits of being a state without being one." He went on to claim, as he has for years, that Canada had charged American farmers massive amounts in tariffs and then delivered the line that closed the message. No more? It's a short phrase, but in the context of 18 months of tariffs, annexation talk, and stalled negotiations, it read as Trump declaring the era of patience with Ottawa officially over. Canada's answer came within hours, and it is the part of this story that genuinely changes the picture. Speaking to reporters in Ottawa on Saturday, Carney said, "Canada will match Washington's new tariffs dollar for dollar in order to protect Canadian workers, farmers, families, and businesses." He confirmed that the new Canadian tariffs would target American steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics, some of these overlapping with products the U.S. had already targeted in Canada, with the full list to be released in the coming days, and the tariffs set to take effect on September 8th. He added that Ottawa would also unveil support measures next week for Canadian industries hurt by the new American duties, and that those support programs could last for years given the scale of the disruption expected. It's worth being honest here about what is confirmed and what is still uncertain, because a story like this can easily blur the two. What is confirmed? The 50% U.S. tariff on that $20 billion slice of Canadian trade, Trump's exact quoted language on Truth Social, Carney's dollar-for-dollar pledge, the September 8th start date, and the list of sectors Carney named. What is not yet confirmed? The precise dollar value of Canada's retaliatory package, since Ottawa said details would follow in the coming days, and whether this round of tariffs will trigger a formal reopening of talks or a longer freeze. Reuters and Al Jazeera both reported that U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer told Fox News on Saturday that no new talks are currently planned, and that from the American side, we're moving forward with measures that respond to Canadian retaliation. That's about as clear a signal as either government has given that this is not simply posturing before a quick return to the table. The reaction inside Canada has been notably unified, for a country that is often politically divided along regional lines. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, whose province is home to much of Canada's auto manufacturing and steel industry, publicly backed Carney's decision not to sign what had been on offer. "I'm glad he didn't sign that deal because it was a bad deal," Ford told reporters. According to Al Jazeera, it was a bad deal for Ontario. It was a bad deal for the auto sector, the steel sector, and manufacturing sector. Public opinion appears to be with him. A poll conducted last week by the firm Legger found that 56% of Canadians favor a tougher approach toward the United States and want their government to make no more concessions. That's a striking number for a country whose economy depends on the U.S. for roughly 70% of its exports, according to Al Jazeera's reporting. A dependency that makes retaliation genuinely costly for Canada, not just symbolically satisfying. That cost is not abstract, and ordinary Canadians interviewed on the ground made that clear. Speaking to Al Jazeera from Port Colborne, Ontario, a resident named Stuart Edwards said the trade war was going to hurt everybody, and called the situation just sad, adding, "We have a bully in Washington, and he's just hitting us all with the big stick all the time, and we're not going to put up with it. Canada isn't. We'll fight back." Another resident, Pamela Coolis from Fort Erie, voiced a more practical worry. telling Al Jazeera she expected gas prices and the cost of everyday goods, from food to lumber, to keep climbing. Al Jazeera's own correspondent reporting from Calgary, David Mercer, summarized the likely economic pain bluntly. Costs going up, prices going up, unemployment going up, with small and medium-sized businesses potentially forced into bankruptcy as the new duties bite. The macroeconomic backdrop makes that warning easier to take seriously. Canada's unemployment rate climbed to 6.8% in December of 2025, according to figures reported by Global News, even before this latest round of 50% tariffs took effect. Deloitte's economic forecasters projected Canadian growth would slow to around 1.5% in 2026, a figure that predates the August collapse in talks, and would presumably come under further pressure now. Reporting from Time also noted that Canada had already entered what was described as a technical recession earlier this year, 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP on an annualized basis, which was itself the news event that prompted Trump's 51st state social media post in June. None of this means the September 8th retaliatory tariffs are guaranteed to push Canada into a deeper downturn. Economists disagree on the precise magnitude of the impact, and Ottawa's promised multi-year support package for affected industries is specifically designed to cushion the blow. But it does mean this fight is landing on an economy that was already showing strain before the latest escalation, not one starting from a position of comfortable strength. There's also a longer-term strategic story unfolding underneath the immediate tariff fight, and it's one that may matter more than any single round of duties. Carney has spent much of the past year traveling to shore up trade relationships outside North America, in Asia, in Europe, and notably in China, where he traveled in January of 2026 to what Global News described as an effort to reset Canada-China relations after a turbulent decade. The clear goal, as Mercer put it in his reporting from Calgary, is diversification, reducing Canada's historical over-reliance on a single trading partner that has, in the space of about 18 months, gone from treating Canada as its closest ally to treating it as a target for both tariffs and repeated suggestions of outright annexation. Diamond Eisinger, a former special advisor to Justin Trudeau, told Al Jazeera that both countries will suffer from this trade war, but argued that Canada had no real alternative left. The U.S. administration responds best, of all the responses that they could have, to all the actions that a government like Canada could take to strength, Eisinger said. So we could not simply accept 50% tariffs going forward. We had to move forward with our own retaliatory package. If you're finding this level of detail useful, connecting today's headline back to the 18 months of tariff letters, court rulings, and election results that actually produced it. That's the entire purpose of this channel, and subscribing means you won't have to go dig through a dozen scattered articles the next time Ottawa or Washington makes a move. It's not only Canadians who are uneasy about where this is heading. Inside the United States, the reaction has split along familiar lines, but with some notable crossover. Democratic governors and lawmakers from states that border Canada were quick to place blame on the White House. New York Governor Kathy Hochul posted on social media that the administration was needlessly picking fights with our allies and raising prices here at home, calling it Trump's economic policy in a nutshell. Beyond partisan politics, the Business Roundtable, a group representing roughly 200 chief executives of major American corporations, issued a warning that the new tariffs risk raising costs for American businesses and families, and urged both governments to get back to the negotiating table. That's a meaningful signal because the Business Roundtable is not a group known for reflexive criticism of Republican trade policy. When an organization representing that much corporate weight publicly flags a tariff round as economically risky, it suggests the concern extends well beyond the usual partisan divide. There's also a wider ripple effect worth flagging, because this fight isn't happening in a vacuum. Carney's push to diversify Canadian trade away from the United States has included a notable warming toward Beijing, with Global News reporting on his January 2026 trip to China aimed at resetting a relationship that had grown turbulent over the preceding decade. That pivot matters strategically because it means Washington's pressure campaign may be producing an outcome opposite to what it presumably intended. Rather than pulling Canada closer through economic coercion, it appears to be pushing Ottawa toward deeper ties with other major economies, including some Washington would rather Canada avoid. It's a dynamic some trade analysts have compared to a broader pattern in Trump's second-term foreign policy, where economic pressure tactics aimed at close allies have occasionally produced diplomatic realignments that cut against America's own stated strategic interests. Though that broader comparison is an analytical framing rather than a settled fact, and reasonable observers disagree on how much weight to give it. The Arctic dimension of this relationship adds another layer that rarely makes it into tariff headlines, but shapes how seriously officials in both capitals take the current standoff. Reporting from the Hub noted that CUSMA renegotiation talks are unfolding alongside increasingly contested questions about Arctic sovereignty, an issue heightened by climate change, opening new shipping routes, and by growing interest from other major powers in the region. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and U.S. Ambassador to Canada Pete Hoekstra have both suggested that a full renegotiation of the broader U.S.-Canada trade relationship could stretch out until 2027, meaning the current tariff fight over dairy, steel, and electronics may end up being just one visible front in a much longer and more complicated negotiation that also touches defense cooperation, missile shield programs, and control of northern waterways. So where does this actually leave things heading into September? On the American side, the 50% tariffs on that roughly $20 billion slice of Canadian goods are already in effect. The Trump administration, through Trade Representative Greer, has signaled no immediate interest in resuming negotiations, framing the current posture as a response to Canadian retaliation rather than an opening position for a new deal. On the Canadian side, Carney is committed to a September 8th start date for dollar retaliatory tariffs, targeting American steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics, alongside a package of domestic support measures for Canadian industries expected to be hit hardest, a package Ottawa has said could remain in place for years, not months. Whether this becomes the deepest and most damaging phase yet of an 18-month trade war, or whether it forces both sides back to a negotiating table neither has fully abandoned, is genuinely not something that can be predicted with confidence right now. Both governments have said things this week that sound final. Both governments have also said things this week that sound final before, only to return to talks days or weeks later. It's also worth putting a number on just how lopsided this economic relationship really is, because that lopsidedness explains why so many analysts describe Canada's options as limited even when its political will to resist is strong. Al Jazeera's reporting placed the U.S. share of Canadian exports at roughly 70%, a level of dependency very few advanced economies have on a single trading partner. A former Canadian trade representative, quoted in CNN's coverage of the talks collapse, described Canada as a victim of geography, pointing out that no amount of diplomatic energy spent courting Asian or European markets can fully substitute, at least in the short term, for a border that runs directly alongside the world's largest consumer economy. That's part of why Carney's government has been careful to frame diversification as a long-term strategic project rather than an immediate offset. Support measures for tariff-hit industries are described as running for years precisely because Ottawa does not expect new export markets to replace lost American demand quickly. It's also worth noting how this specific dispute connects back to the fentanyl justification that started the entire chain of events in February 2025. Carney has repeatedly stated that his government is committed to what he has called stopping the scourge of fentanyl in North America, and has pointed to concrete steps taken in response to you. Hess pressure, including the appointment of a dedicated fentanyl czar and a border security package reported by Fox News to be worth roughly $1.3 billion, funding Black Hawk helicopters, drones, mobile surveillance towers, and close to 10,000 additional frontline personnel. Those measures were largely credited, in earlier reporting, with reducing apprehensions and drug seizures at the northern border. That makes the current round of 50% tariffs notable for a specific reason. It was not triggered by a new fentanyl or migration dispute at all. It emerged entirely from a breakdown over economic terms, automotive market access, critical minerals, and the scope of future trade deals, which suggests the original border security rationale from 2025 has, at least for now, been replaced by a more conventional, if unusually bitter, economic negotiation. What can be said with confidence is this: the relationship between these two countries has fundamentally changed in a way that goes beyond any single tariff schedule. For most of the post-war era, the idea of the US and Canada engaging in a genuine trade war, complete with matching retaliatory tariffs and a sitting American president publicly floating the outright annexation of his neighbor, would have sounded implausible to serious analysts on either side of the border. That is no longer a hypothetical. It is the situation Ottawa is living through right now, and it is the situation shaping how ordinary Canadians shop, invest, and think about their own economic future. Analysts like Frank Graves, the pollster who tracked the collapse of the Conservative lead in early 2025, have pointed to Trump's rhetoric as one of the most consequential external influences on Canadian domestic politics in decades, a rare case where a foreign leader's public statements measurably reshaped an election outcome in a neighboring democracy. Before we get into a few honest caveats, it's worth pausing to say that if you want the fuller context behind stories like this one, the kind of layered timeline that connects a single Truth Social post to 18 months of policy history, that's exactly the kind of tracking this channel tries to do every time a story like this breaks, so that when the next headline lands, you already understand the 18 months of history sitting underneath it. Now, a brief and honest accounting of where this story stands. The confirmed facts in this script: The February 2025 tariff order, the 51st state rhetoric documented across multiple outlets since December 2024, Trudeau's resignation and Carney's election, the Supreme Court's February 2026 ruling in Learning Resources versus Trump, the collapse of talks on August 21st, the 50% U, S tariffs on roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods, Trump's exact no more, quote, and Carney's September 8th retaliation pledge, all trace back to named sources. Reuters, Al Jazeera, CNN, the BBC, CNBC, Forbes, ABC News, Time, The Hub, NerdWallet, and CBC, along with on-the-record statements from Trump, Carney, Ford, Greer, and other named officials. What remains unverified or unresolved as of this recording? The exact dollar figure of Canada's retaliatory tariff package. Since Ottawa has said full details are still to come, the long-term economic damage estimates, which vary depending on which economist or institution you ask, and whether talks will resume before or after the September 8th deadline, which neither government has confirmed either way. Where Trump's stated justification for these tariffs, fentanyl flows through Canada, has been directly contradicted by U.S. Customs and Border Protection's own published data. That contradiction is noted here rather than smoothed over, because a fair account of this story has to hold both things at once. The tariffs are real, and their effects will be real, and the official justification for the original 2025 tariffs has been publicly disputed by the government's own numbers. If you've been following this relationship for the past year and a half, you've probably noticed the pattern by now: a threat, a partial retreat, a new threat, a legal setback, and then a fresh escalation that somehow manages to go further than the last one. This latest round, built around 2 exclamation points and a Saturday morning press conference in Ottawa, fits that pattern. But it also marks the first time Canada has answered an American tariff round with an equally specific, equally public commitment to match it dollar for dollar, rather than simply absorbing the hit or offering fresh concessions. Whether that marks a genuine turning point in how Ottawa deals with Washington, or simply another chapter in a fight that keeps resetting itself, is something only the coming weeks will show. Here's the honest, open question worth sitting with. Does Canada's dollar-for-dollar response actually change Washington's calculus? Or does it simply lock both countries into a longer and more expensive standoff that neither side's own businesses and consumers actually want? Reasonable people, including reasonable people quoted in this very script, disagree on the answer. If you have a view on where this goes next, or on what Ottawa should be doing differently, the comment section is open, and this is a conversation worth having, honestly, rather than from a fixed side. Thanks for watching, and we'll keep tracking this one as it develops.